today I would do a little discourse on elections, seeing as it seems to be in the news over the last little while. I became interested in politics at a very young age, due, I think, mostly because of my grandfather. My grandfather, who was, for the most part, a jovial type of guy, when it came election time, his countenance turned much more serious. He would be polishing up his four-wheeled wagon, washing down his oxen, putting on his best jumper, and all day he would go around the community, pick up people, and take them to the polling station, all the while extolling the virtues of the party that he was in favor of, while at the same time warning his riders that a vote for the other party would lead to eventual ruin, period. Now, I don't think I've ever gone quite that far, but it seemed to me that if he felt that seriously about politics, that maybe I better pay a little bit of attention. I became eligible to vote in 1963, and there must have been an election that year because I remember at the beginning of the second quarter of 1964, just about the time that the Beatles were releasing their second or third song, I was transferred. I'd been working at the bank, so I was transferred away and spent the rest of my working career away from here. I remember that as the campaign began, I would pay attention to the TV, and also there would be articles in the newspaper, and I would listen to the older people as they talked about who they thought should win the election. So on election day, the weather was pretty good. At least it was good enough for me to be able to walk to the polling station, which wasn't very far away. So I'd be trotting down the main drag and around the curlicues over the Barrington River Bridge and to the polling station. And I went inside to the main table and presented myself to the two not quite young ladies for their scrutiny. I was asked for my identification, and even though the lady called me by name because Barrington being a small community, everybody practically knew everybody else. So I did present my identification while the other lady checked to make sure that my name was on the voting list, to which of course it was, and she crossed me off to make sure that I couldn't come back later on after dark wearing a hoodie and a false mustache and try and go again to vote for a second time. Of course, I don't think there was any hoodies in those days. I was presented with a ballot and was instructed that I could go behind the blind and there would be a pencil waiting there for me and I could mark my ballot as I saw fit. So I walked confidently over to the blind, and standing there, I opened up my ballot and I saw what I expected. For instance, there was the Liberal Party of Canada and a little white circle. There was a Conservative Party of Canada with a little white circle. And below that was either the CCF or the Social Credit, which one came after the other, and later on they morphed into the New Democratic Party, and with a little circle at the end. But to my surprise and later shock and horror, there was a fourth line, and it said, the Communist Party of Canada. And I looked at that, and I conjured up images of Nikita Khrushchev, who was premier of what is now Russia, but was then in those days called the USSR, which is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it had only been less than a year since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I mentally shook my fist at that line. And I picked up my pencil. I said, I must make sure I do not spoil this ballot. So I started practicing marking little X's in the air so I'd know how to do it. Not that I'd never seen an X before, because when I used to pass in papers to my teacher, I'd often find quite a few X's marked on there. And there'd also be some O's in there too, but the O's were actually zeros, not O's. But as it turned out, I had gotten enough check marks on my papers so that I did graduate from high school satisfactorily. I recall walking home afterwards, and I thought to myself, and I looked up skyward, and I said, okay, in not these words, but in similar sentiment, okay, Grandpa Scott, I see what you meant. He had died 5 years earlier, so he was not a part of that anymore. We are lucky in Canada to live in a democracy, and we are able to vote in people that will govern us. And at the same time, if we aren't happy with them later on, we have the ability to vote them out. And that's not the case in many countries. And in fact, even in democracies, they are not always as stable as ours. So it's incumbent upon me, I think, that I should always keep an eye out on what's going on and should always vote. In the last several days, there have been reports and allegations even that China has or had possibly interfered with our elections, federal elections of 2021. And it is stated that at least 2 conservative MPs were defeated by 2 liberal MPs that were a result of the interference of the government of China. Now, 2 out of 338 is not a lot, but even 1 is a cause for concern. And there has been some back and forth as to what was done or what should be done. And from my understanding, there are at least 2 committees that look after elections when they time to come around, so that things like these are watched out for and guarded against as best as is possible. There is some back and forth, of course. There is some partisanship going on as to what actually happened or what actually should happen. But there are, I believe, 2 agencies that can give us some answers as much as they can without interfering with the security of our country. So I'm hoping some of them or someone from an organization like that will step forward and give us a little bit more information about what actually happened and what has been done and what can be done to make sure that our elections are not interfered with. When I first heard about this, I thought to myself, why in the world would China ever favor one party over another in this country? Because over the last number of years, the relationship between our 2 countries have not been very good, and it has not improved any over the last number of years under the tenureship of our current Prime Minister. But on watching TV last night, someone came up with an answer which I thought sounded plausible to me, and that is that China really wants to sow discord among the population about the reliability of our election process, to put doubt in people's mind as to the validity of our elections. Now that I can see, and that is something that I think that we should be very careful of. But at the same time, I think of one of the gentlemen who was involved, and I won't try and pronounce his name because I'll get it wrong. But I'm thinking maybe he is just a Canadian who presented himself as a to be elected and is as Canadian as anyone else and is as loyal to our country as anyone else would be that wasn't of Chinese ancestry. Because after all, some generations of Chinese people have gone back to the 1800s, back to when the railroad was built. And compared to me, for instance, I was born in England, so I wasn't even born here. Yet I'm a loyal Canadian. I don't think very many people would question that. So we have to take into consideration him as well. But in conclusion, though, we always should pay attention to what's going on in these types of events. And there is actually a line in our national anthem, which I think says it all, and that is, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Good night from Barrington.